They called me slow. They called me broken. They called me the worst investment Mr. Thompson had ever made. And on the morning of August 14th, 1857, as I stood on the auction block in the suffocating heat of a Mississippi summer, watching my master describe me to the crowd as barely worth the rope to hang her, I understood that my greatest weapon had always been their inability to see what was right in front of them. My name is Ada, and I live in a world made of numbers, not the simple counting that everyone does, 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean the architecture of numbers, the patterns that connect everything, the invisible structure that holds the universe together. When I look at a pile of cotton bales, I don't see cotton. I see dimensions multiplying into volume, density factors, moisture content adjustments, final weight calculations that appear in my mind as clearly as if they'd been written in ink. When I hear footsteps, I don't just hear walking. I hear rhythm patterns, stride length calculations, weight distribution, predictive trajectories of where that person will be in exactly 37 seconds. It's been this way for as long as I can remember. My mother told me that even as an infant, I was different. While other babies cried randomly, my cries followed patterns, regular intervals based on hunger cycles that she could predict to the minute. By age 3, when most children were just learning to count to 10, I was observing the cotton harvest and announcing weights that the adult workers couldn't calculate without scales. My mother was a house servant, one of the more privileged enslaved people on the Thompson plantation, because she'd been born there, and the Thompson family had owned her mother before her. This gave her certain advantages: better food, lighter work, closer proximity to the family's private life. It also meant she understood how dangerous my difference was. "Don't let them see what you can do," she'd whisper to me when I was small, when I'd start calculating out loud, unable to contain the numbers that flooded my mind. "They don't understand it, baby. They'll think you're touched by something evil, or they'll try to use you up. Either way, nothing good comes from them knowing." But I couldn't always hide it. The numbers were too insistent, too present, too much a part of how I experienced the world. When I was 7 years old, I made my first critical mistake. It was harvest time, and there'd been a dispute about the cotton weights. The overseer, a brutal man named Carstairs, who'd been with the Thompson family for 15 years, had accused my father, who worked the scales, of cheating, of somehow manipulating the weights to steal cotton. The accusation was absurd. My father was scrupulously honest, had never stolen anything in his life. But Carstairs wanted a scapegoat for his own miscalculations, and enslaved people made convenient targets. I was standing nearby with my mother, supposed to be helping her carry water to the field workers, and I could see the whole scene unfolding. Thompson himself had come out to investigate, furious at the suggestion that his operation was being undermined by theft. The cotton in question was piled on a wagon, and there was argument about whether it had been properly weighed. The numbers were so clear in my mind, I could see the dimensions of the pile, calculate the density based on how the cotton was compressed, factor in the moisture content based on the humidity that day, and where the cotton had been stored overnight. The actual weight was 847 pounds, not the 920 that Carstairs was claiming, or the 815 that the original weighing had shown. 1847, I whispered, too quiet for anyone but my mother and father to hear. The real weight is 1847 pounds. The difference is moisture, 3.2% differential based on storage location. My father, desperate and terrified, seized on the number. He repeated it to Thompson, explaining the moisture calculation. At first, Thompson was skeptical, but something about the specificity of the number made him pause. He ordered the cotton reweighed after being moved to a drier location and allowed to equilibrate. 1847 pounds. Exactly. The silence that followed was profound. Thompson stared at the scale, then at my father. Then his eyes swept the gathered crowd until they landed on me. I saw recognition in his face, though he said nothing at the time. My father was vindicated, Carstairs was reprimanded, and the incident passed into plantation history. But Thompson had noticed, and standing to the side that day, watching everything with sharp eyes, had been a silver-haired man named Blackwood, an auctioneer and property assessor who did business with Thompson regularly. I'd seen him look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not suspicion exactly, more like someone who'd just seen something valuable that others had missed. After that day, I tried harder to hide my abilities, but it was like trying to hide breathing. The numbers were everywhere, constant, impossible to ignore. And as I grew older and was assigned actual work, my difference became a problem. In the cotton fields, I was a disaster. While other workers moved down the rows with practiced efficiency, I would stand frozen, overwhelmed by the geometric patterns of the plants, calculating optimal harvesting angles and growth rates and yield predictions. My fingers were clumsy with the actual picking, but my mind was racing through equations that would have impressed a university mathematician. My basket would be nearly empty, while others had filled theirs twice over. The overseer's whip found my back regularly. 10 lashes for insufficient productivity, 15 for daydreaming, 20 for willful laziness. But the pain couldn't make my mind work the way they wanted it to. I simply wasn't built for the kind of mindless, repetitive labor that plantation work demanded. They tried me in the kitchen next, thinking maybe I'd be better suited for domestic work. That was worse. I'd stand in front of the fire, fascinated by the heat diffusion patterns, calculating temperature gradients and combustion rates, while the food I was supposed to be cooking burned to ash. I'd pour water into pots and become entranced by the fluid dynamics, the way the water moved and settled, the surface tension creating perfect mathematical curves, and I'd forget entirely what I was supposed to be preparing. The head cook, an older woman named Martha who'd been trying to train me, finally threw up her hands in frustration. "This child ain't right," she told my mother. "She stares at things like she's seeing something that ain't there, can't follow the simplest instruction. I tell her to stir the pot. She stands there looking at the spoon like it's the most fascinating thing in the world. She gonna hurt herself or burn the whole kitchen down?" My mother tried to defend me, tried to explain that I wasn't stupid or crazy, just different. But how do you explain to people in 1845 that your daughter's brain processes information in ways that make her seem broken, when actually she's performing complex calculations that wouldn't be formally studied by mathematicians for another 50 years? By the time I was 15, I'd been tried at virtually every job on the plantation and failed at all of them. Field work, kitchen work, laundry, childcare. I was incompetent at everything that required sustained attention to mundane tasks. Thompson kept me on only because selling a 15-year-old girl would have raised questions about why his plantation was producing workers who couldn't function, which would reflect poorly on his management. But his patience was wearing thin. I'd hear him complaining to his wife, his voice carrying through the walls of the big house. "That girl is costing me money every day she draws breath. Can't sell her, can't use her. Can't even give her away without admitting I've got defective property. What am I supposed to do with her?" My mother died when I was 17, worn out by decades of labor and worry. Her last words to me were a whisper. "Your difference ain't a curse, baby. It's something special. Somewhere, somehow, there's a place where what you can do matters. You just got to survive long enough to find it." I didn't believe her. How could I? I was a slave on a Mississippi plantation in the 1850s, considered worthless by everyone who had power over me, unable to perform the most basic tasks expected of me. What possible future could there be? After my mother died, things got worse. Without her subtle interventions and explanations, without her running interference between me and the overseer's frustrations, I was completely exposed. Thompson's patience finally exhausted itself. "I'm done," he announced one evening at dinner, his voice carrying through to the kitchen where I was supposed to be cleaning dishes, but was actually calculating the geometric patterns in the wood grain of the table. "That girl has been nothing but a drain on this plantation's resources for her entire life. I want her sold at the next auction. I don't care what she brings, I just want her gone." His wife made a token protest, something about my mother's years of faithful service, about family loyalty, but Thompson was immovable. "Her mother was useful. This one is broken. I've given her every chance, and she's failed at everything. She's 20 years old and hasn't produced a single day's productive labor. Enough." So, on August 14th, 1857, I found myself in a wagon heading to the county seat for the monthly slave auction, along with 3 other people Thompson was selling for various reasons. Joseph, whose shattered leg made him too slow for field work. Sarah, who'd been caught teaching her children to read. Marcus, a teenage boy who'd tried to run away twice. We didn't speak much during the 2-hour journey. What was there to say? We were commodities being transported to market, our individual stories irrelevant to the transactions that would determine our futures. But I counted everything, as always. The wagon wheels made 43 revolutions per minute at our current speed. The distance between Thompson's plantation and the county seat was 11. 7 miles based on time elapsed and velocity calculations. We passed 247 fence posts, each one spaced approximately 3 feet apart. 3 bridges spanning waterways of 23, 47, and 31 feet respectively. 2 small settlements with population densities calculable from visible housing structures, approximately 1. 4 persons per dwelling in the first, 2, 1 in the second, based on building sizes and typical occupancy patterns. The numbers were a comfort, a familiar pattern in a terrifying situation. As long as I could count, as long as I could calculate, I still existed as myself rather than just as property being transferred. The auction house was a large wooden structure on the main street of the county seat, purpose-built for the buying and selling of human beings. I'd been there once before when I was 12, when my mother had been sent to help with Thompson's wife, who was shopping for house servants at the auction. I remembered the building's dimensions: 87 feet long, 43 feet wide, ceiling height 14 feet at the peak of the roof. Capacity approximately 200 people if densely packed, though typical auctions drew maybe 60-80 buyers and observers. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and human sweat, and the particular tension that comes from financial transactions involving human lives. The architecture of the room was designed to optimize the auctioneer's visibility and voice projection. The platform was exactly 7 feet high, positioned 23 feet from the back wall, with the seating arranged in a semicircle that provided clear sightlines from every position. The auctioneer was a man named Blackwood, and I recognized him immediately. He was older now. 12 years had passed since that day with the cotton dispute, but still carried himself with the same sharp-eyed confidence. He was in his late 60s now, silver hair perfectly groomed, dressed in an expensive suit that spoke of prosperity built on commissions from human sales. As we waited in the holding area behind the auction platform, I watched Blackwood preparing for the day's sales, conferring with various plantation owners and traders about the lots being offered. He moved with practiced efficiency, a man who'd conducted these transactions thousands of times and knew exactly how to maximize value from each sale. Did he remember me? That day with the cotton, my impossible calculation. I couldn't tell. If he did, he gave no sign of it. The auction proceeded through its usual rhythm. Joseph sold for $600 to a blacksmith who needed an assistant and wasn't concerned about his mobility issues. Smithing work could be done sitting down, and Joseph's upper body strength was excellent. Sarah fetched $800 from a buyer who wanted a house servant and actually saw her literacy as an asset rather than a threat. Marcus went for $200 to a brutal work camp in the Mississippi Delta, a place where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades, and the only thing that mattered was how much labor could be extracted before a worker died. And then, it was my turn. "Next lot," Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the practiced rhythm of a man who'd conducted thousands of these transactions. "Female, age 20, name of Ada, from the Thompson plantation. Mr. Thompson, would you care to describe the lot?" Thompson stood, and I could hear the eagerness in his voice, the desire to finally be rid of his burden. "She's healthy enough in body," he began, damning with faint praise. "No diseases, no major physical defects. Strong back, good teeth. Should have years of working life ahead of her." He paused, and I could feel the but coming. "But I'll be straight with you, gentlemen, because I value my reputation for honesty. This one's never been worth the food it takes to feed her. Can't follow the simplest instructions. Can't work at any useful pace, seems to exist in her own world half the time. I've tried her at field work. Useless. Tried her in the kitchen. Burned everything she touched. Tried her at laundry, couldn't manage basic washing. She's been a drain on my plantation's resources for 20 years, and I'm selling her as is, with no representations about future productivity." The crowd murmured, a sound like wind through dry grass. Several men shook their heads, already dismissing me as not worth consideration. I saw one planter actually laugh, nudging his neighbor and making some comment I couldn't hear but could easily imagine. "Starting bid $50, Thompson concluded, setting the price at barely above worthless. $50. For context, a strong field hand in peak condition might sell for $1,500. A skilled carpenter or blacksmith could fetch $2,000. A beautiful young woman destined for house service in a wealthy home might bring $1,800. Thompson was pricing me as damaged goods, as barely worth transporting. Blackwood began his pitch, but even his considerable skills as an auctioneer couldn't make much of Thompson's devastating description. $50, gentlemen, for a young female, 20 years old, healthy in body, could perhaps be trained for $40. The bid came from the back of the room, from a rough-looking trader named Macklin, who specialized in buying slaves cheap and selling them to the worst work camps in Louisiana. Places where life was measured in months, where the only thing that mattered was how much could be extracted before a worker died and was replaced. Nobody counted. $40 was already more than most people thought I was worth. $40, Blackwood said, his voice neutral. Do I hear 45? Silence. Men were already looking away, dismissing me, moving on mentally to the next lot. $40 once, Blackwood intoned. $40 twice. $500. The voice came from the side of the room, quiet but absolutely clear. Every head turned. The bid had come from a well-dressed man I didn't recognize, someone who carried himself with the confidence of substantial wealth. An agent of some kind, representing someone who wasn't present. The room erupted in confused murmurs. $500 for the slave that Thompson himself had just described as worthless. Thompson stood up, shock evident on his face. There must be some mistake. The lot is $500, the agent repeated calmly, on behalf of my client, Monsieur Armand Dubois of New Orleans. Blackwood's expression was carefully neutral, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Knowledge, recognition. This wasn't a surprise to him. Somehow, impossibly, he'd known this would happen. Well, Blackwood said, recovering his auctioneer's patter smoothly. It seems we have a serious bidder. Do I hear 550? Macklin, the rough trader, was staring at me with new eyes, thinking he must have missed something valuable, some hidden quality that the wealthy agent could see. 550, he called out, his voice uncertain. 600, the agent countered immediately, no hesitation. 650, Macklin responded, committed now. $1,000. The agent's voice remained calm, almost bored, as if he could do this all day without concern. Macklin sat down hard. At $1,000, this was no longer a bargain hunt. This was serious money, the kind of price you paid for premium workers. But the commotion had attracted attention from other planters in the room. Men who dismissed me moments ago were now looking at me with new interest. If someone was willing to pay that much, surely there must be something they'd overlooked, some hidden value. 1,100, a planter named Simmons called out, a man who owned a large plantation in the southern part of the county. 1,200, another joined in, a wealthy landowner named Pettigrew. 1,500, the agent said, his tone unchanged as if the escalating price was completely expected and irrelevant to his purpose. The room went silent. $1,500 was an enormous sum for any enslaved person, let alone one who'd been described by her own master as worse than useless. Thompson sat frozen, his mind clearly racing. He'd expected to get maybe $75 if he was lucky, maybe only $40. Now he was watching the price climb to heights he'd never imagined. 1,600, Simmons countered, determined now, convinced that there must be something extraordinary he was missing. $2,000, the agent said, his voice cutting through the excited murmurs. Final offer. My client wants this particular lot, and he's prepared to end the bidding now at a price that should satisfy everyone. $2,000. The room was utterly silent. That was the price of the finest workers, the most skilled craftsmen, the most valuable property a plantation could possess. It was more than Thompson paid most of his overseers in 3 years of salary. Blackwood looked around the room slowly, letting the moment stretch, building the drama. "Gentlemen, we have a bid of $2,000. This is a significant offer. Do I hear 2,100? Simmons was shaking his head, calculating in his mind whether any slave could possibly justify that price, especially one with the reputation Thompson had given me. Pettigrew had already sat down out of the bidding. $2,000 once, Blackwood intoned, his voice carrying perfect theatrical timing. $2,000 twice. He paused, letting the silence build, giving anyone who wanted to bid one last chance. "Sold," he declared, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack that seemed to reverberate through the entire building. To the agent representing Monsieur Armand Dubois of New Orleans, for $2,000. The sound of that gavel was the sound of my life changing forever, though I didn't know it yet. All I knew was that something impossible had just happened. I, Ada, the useless slave, the broken girl who couldn't perform the simplest tasks, had just been sold for more money than Thompson had paid for his 3 best field hands combined. Thompson approached the agent immediately after the sale concluded, his confusion warring with greedy satisfaction at the unexpected windfall. "Pardon me, sir, but I must know. What does your client see in that girl? I've owned her for her entire life, and I can honestly say she's been nothing but a loss. Every year I kept her was money thrown away." The agent smiled slightly, an expression that contained knowledge Thompson would never have access to. "My client has particular needs, Mr. Thompson, specialized requirements that your loss has fulfilled admirably. You should be pleased. You've just turned your worst investment into your best return. But what will he use her for? She can't work. She can't—" "That, Mr. Thompson, is my client's concern now, not yours." The agent produced a bank draft from an inner pocket, the paper crisp and official, representing more money than many people in the room would see in a lifetime. $2,000, as agreed. The transaction is complete. Thompson took the draft with trembling hands, staring at it like he couldn't quite believe it was real. And perhaps he couldn't. In his mind, he'd been disposing of garbage and somehow struck gold. The cognitive dissonance must have been profound. I was escorted out of the auction house by the agent. His name was Rousseau, I learned. A Frenchman who'd been in America for 20 years, handling business affairs for wealthy clients in New Orleans. He had a fine carriage waiting, better than any vehicle I'd ever ridden in, with cushioned seats and windows of real glass. "Monsieur Dubois wishes me to assure you that you will not be mistreated," Rousseau said as we began the long journey south toward New Orleans, his English carrying a French accent that made certain words sound musical. "You are valuable to him, and valuable things are treated with care." I said nothing, staring out the window as the Mississippi countryside rolled past. Valuable. Everyone had called me worthless my entire life, and now suddenly I was valuable. But valuable for what? What did this mysterious Dubois want with a slave who couldn't perform basic labor? The journey to New Orleans took 3 days. We stopped at decent inns each night, and I was given actual food rather than scraps, was allowed to wash, was treated with a careful courtesy that was deeply unsettling, precisely because it was so unexpected. Rousseau didn't speak to me beyond basic necessities, but he didn't treat me cruelly either. I was cargo, yes, but valuable cargo that required proper handling. If you're following Ada's transformation from worthless property to the memory of an empire, take a moment to let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe to discover more untold stories of enslaved people whose extraordinary abilities became weapons of survival and subtle vengeance in America's darkest chapter. New Orleans, when we finally arrived, was overwhelming. I'd never been to a real city before. The plantation had been my entire world. 800 acres that I could calculate to the inch, buildings whose dimensions I knew perfectly, a population of maybe 150 people total, including the Thompson family and all the enslaved workers. New Orleans was chaos by comparison, thousands upon thousands of people compressed into a relatively small space, creating patterns of movement and interaction so complex my mind struggled to organize them. The sounds were cacophonous, multiple languages being spoken simultaneously, French and English and Spanish and African languages I couldn't identify, merchants calling out their wares, horses and carriages clattering on cobblestone streets, ships' horns from the port, music spilling out of buildings at all hours. The smells were equally intense: cooking food, human waste, river water, tobacco smoke, perfumes and spices from the market. And the architecture, oh, the buildings, structures of such elegant mathematical proportion that I found myself staring constantly, calculating golden ratios and load-bearing requirements and geometric relationships. The French Quarter buildings especially, with their wrought-iron balconies and perfect symmetries, were almost painful in their beauty to my number-obsessed mind. We traveled through the heart of the city to a mansion on Esplanade Avenue, one of the wealthy streets where the successful merchants and businessmen built their homes. The mansion was 3 stories tall, constructed in the French colonial style with galleries on every level. Its proportions so perfect, I immediately began calculating the architectural ratios. Approximately 1:618 to 1, the golden ratio that appeared throughout nature and in the most beautiful human constructions. Inside, the wealth was even more apparent. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, artwork on every wall, furniture that looked like it had been imported from Europe at enormous expense. This was the home of someone with serious money, serious power. I was brought to a large study on the 2nd floor, a room lined with books from floor to ceiling, hundreds of volumes, maybe thousands, more books than I'd ever seen in one place. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat a man in his 50s, well dressed in the French style, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of casual authority that suggested he was accustomed to having his will obeyed. "Ada," he said, his accent marking him as French, or at least French-educated. "My name is Armand Dubois. Please sit down." I sat, confusion warring with caution. Enslaved people didn't sit in the presence of their owners, didn't make eye contact, certainly didn't have conversations like equals. But Dubois was gesturing to a comfortable chair across from his desk, as if this was a normal business meeting. "I imagine you're wondering," Dubois continued, watching my face carefully, "why I paid $2,000 for a slave who can't pick cotton or cook a meal without burning it." I said nothing. It wasn't my place to speak unless directly asked a question. 7 years and 4 months ago," Dubois said, settling back in his chair, "I was in Mississippi on business with the Thompson plantation. There was a dispute about cotton weights. A young girl, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, whispered something to her father. A number. The exact weight of the cotton, calculated in her head, accounting for moisture variables that even experienced cotton traders hadn't considered. When they checked her number, it was perfect. Impossibly, precisely perfect. My breath caught. He remembered. That moment I'd thought had passed unnoticed. Someone had been paying attention. "I asked about you afterward," Dubois continued, very discreetly, through intermediaries who wouldn't connect the questions back to me. "I learned that you were considered slow, useless, unable to perform basic tasks. But I also learned about other incidents, times when you'd announced numbers that turned out to be eerily accurate. Weights, distances, quantities, always numbers." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I have a friend in France, a mathematician at the university in Paris. He told me once about people like you, people whose minds work differently, who can calculate things that normal people can't, who see patterns invisible to others. The medical term is savant syndrome, though it's poorly understood. The mathematical term is eidetic calculation. The common term is genius. Genius. I'd been called many things in my 20 years, but never that." "You're not broken, Ada," Dubois said quietly. "You're extraordinary. Your mind processes numbers the way most people breathe, automatically, constantly, perfectly. You can't help it any more than you can help having brown eyes, but it makes you useless for picking cotton and brilliant for what I need." "What do you need?" The words escaped before I could stop them, a violation of every rule about how enslaved people should behave. But Dubois just smiled. "I need something that cannot be written down, something that cannot be stolen or burned or seized by authorities. I need a ledger that exists only in memory. And you, Ada, have the most extraordinary memory I've ever encountered." He stood and walked to a large map on the wall, showing shipping routes throughout the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, lines connecting dozens of ports. "My business is complicated," I move goods that cannot be legally moved. I arrange transactions that cannot be legally documented. I manage finances that cannot be legally recorded. For years, I've maintained physical ledgers, hidden in various secure locations, but physical ledgers can be found, seized, used as evidence against me. He turned to look at me directly. I need a ledger that lives in a human mind, someone who can remember every transaction, every number, every detail perfectly, and recall it when needed. Someone who can calculate profits and losses and projections without paper or pen. Someone whose ability is so unusual that no one would believe it exists, which makes it the perfect hiding place. My mind was racing through the implications, calculating possibilities and risks and outcomes. You want me to memorize your business records? I want you to be my business records, he corrected. Every transaction, every shipment, every payment, every debt, every connection, it will all live in your mind, perfect and uncapturable. The question is, can you do this? I thought about the numbers that had filled my head my entire life, the constant stream of calculations that everyone had dismissed as evidence of my uselessness. The patterns I saw everywhere, the mathematical relationships that connected everything, the way my mind automatically processed and stored numerical information with perfect clarity. Yes, I said simply. Yes, I can do this. Then we begin today, Dubois said. And Ada? You should know something. What I'm asking you to do is invaluable to me, literally invaluable. I cannot function without it, cannot maintain my business without it, which means you have power here, even though legally you're my property. I need you to succeed, which means I need you healthy, rested, well-fed, and willing to cooperate. Do you understand what I'm saying? I understood. In the brutal mathematics of slavery, value created its own kind of protection. If I was truly irreplaceable, truly essential to his empire, then I was too valuable to abuse, too important to mistreat. I understand, I said. And so began the strangest chapter of my life. I was given a room in Dubois' mansion, not a slave quarter, not a basement cell, but an actual bedroom on the second floor, with a real bed, a door that locked from the inside, a window that looked out over the street. The room was approximately 15 feet by 18 feet, with ceiling height of 11 feet. Walls painted in a soft cream color that reflected light at optimal angles for reading. I was given clothes that weren't rags, dresses that fit properly and were made of good fabric. I was fed the same food as the household, real meals with meat and vegetables and bread, not the scraps and cornmeal that enslaved people typically received. My only task was to attend Dubois in his study for several hours each day while he conducted business, and to remember everything. It was almost absurdly easy for me. The numbers that everyone had thought made me broken were exactly what made me perfect for this role. Dubois would conduct a meeting with a ship captain discussing a cargo of smuggled rum from Cuba, and I would sit quietly in the corner, apparently just a servant, while my mind captured every detail. 700 cases of rum, purchased at 3, 50 per case. Total cost, $2, $450. Transportation arranged through Captain Morrison on the ship Seabird, fee of $600. Bribed Harbor Master Johnson $175 to overlook the illegal cargo. Customs Inspector Pearson $125 for the same. Sold the rum to various taverns and merchants in New Orleans for an average of 7. 25 per case, total revenue $5,075. Net profit after all expenses $1,725. Transaction completed June 7, 1857. The numbers slotted into my mind as naturally as breathing, becoming part of the vast mathematical architecture I'd been building unconsciously my entire life. Every transaction integrated with all the others, creating patterns of profit and loss, identifying trends and opportunities, revealing the structure of Dubois' empire in perfect clarity. Within the first month, I held the complete details of Dubois' operations for that period in my memory. 36 transactions involving everything from smuggled tobacco to illegal slave trading to contraband luxury goods from Europe. Every ship, every captain, every bribe, every profit margin. Within 6 months, I held the entire previous year's business in my mind. Hundreds of transactions, thousands of individual numbers, complex webs of relationships and dependencies that would have required enormous physical ledgers to document on paper. And Dubois tested me constantly. Ada, what did we pay Captain Morrison for the rum transportation in June? $600, sir. What was our profit margin on that transaction? 41.6% after all expenses, sir. How much have we paid in bribes to Harbour Master Johnson over the past 6 months? I didn't even have to pause to calculate. 17 bribes totaling $2,975, averaging approximately $175 per transaction, sir. Every answer was instant and perfect. My mind had organized all the information into interconnected networks that I could access as easily as reaching for a book on a shelf. Perhaps more easily. I never forgot, never misremembered, never confused one transaction with another. Dubois' initial caution gradually transformed into trust, then into something approaching awe. I wasn't just remembering numbers, I was seeing patterns he'd missed, making connections between transactions that revealed opportunities or warned of risks. Your profit margin on tobacco has decreased by 7% over the past 3 months, I told him one day in October. This is primarily due to increased bribe costs at the port. Harbour Master Johnson has raised his fees twice. Meanwhile, your rum operations have maintained consistent margins because you're using Captain Morrison, who has negotiated lower rates with Customs Inspector Pearson. I would recommend shifting more capital toward rum and reducing tobacco until you can negotiate better bribery terms. Dubois stared at me. You can see all that? It's just patterns in the numbers, sir. The relationships become clear when you can see all the transactions together. He'd hired me to be a ledger, but I was becoming something more, an analyst, an advisor, someone who could see the shape of his business in ways he couldn't because all the information existed in one place, my mind. As my first year with Dubois ended, I found myself in a position I'd never imagined possible. I was still legally enslaved. Dubois owned me as property, could sell me or kill me without legal consequence, but practically, I'd become essential to his operations, indispensable. Without me, his entire business empire would collapse. And slowly, carefully, I began to test the boundaries of my new power. Sir, I said one evening as we reviewed some complex transactions, I've been calculating the risk profiles of your various operations. The slave trading carries the highest legal risk. If you're caught, the penalties are severe, and your connections in government might not be able to protect you. But it also provides the lowest profit margins. 19% average over the past year, compared to 37% for tobacco and 41% for rum. From a pure business perspective, you should exit slave trading entirely. Dubois looked at me thoughtfully. That's a moral stance disguised as business analysis. It's both, sir. The moral stance is that slavery is evil. The business analysis is that it's also increasingly dangerous and decreasingly profitable. Both things can be true. He was silent for a long moment. Then, what would you do if you were freed, Ada? The question caught me off guard. Sir, if I freed you right now, gave you papers saying you were no longer enslaved, what would you do? I thought about it carefully, calculating possibilities. I would ask to continue working for you, sir, for fair wages and under contract rather than ownership, because this work is the first thing I've ever done that uses what I can do rather than punishing me for what I can't do, and because I have nowhere else to go and no other skills that would support me. You'd choose to stay? He seemed genuinely surprised. I choose to continue this work, sir. Whether I'm enslaved or free doesn't change the fact that I'm good at this, that I find the numbers. Beautiful in a way most people wouldn't understand, but free. I could negotiate terms, could have autonomy, could build something of my own eventually. Dubois nodded slowly. I'll consider it. But you should know, if I free you, others will ask questions, will want to know why, might investigate. Your abilities would be exposed, and that would put both of us at risk. He was right, of course. My invisibility as enslaved property was part of what made me effective. No one paid attention to slaves in the room. No one imagined we might be listening, analyzing, remembering everything. So I remained enslaved officially. But the nature of my enslavement changed. Dubois began paying me wages, secretly, deposited in accounts that he helped me establish under false names. Not enormous amounts, but enough that over time I was accumulating genuine wealth of my own. He also began introducing me to his business associates as his assistant rather than his property, a euphemism that allowed me to be present during meetings without constant explanation. Some visitors assumed I was his mistress, which was humiliating but useful. They dismissed me as ornamental and spoke freely in front of me, never imagining that I was capturing every word, every number, every secret they revealed. Years passed. The numbers in my mind grew more numerous, the patterns more complex. By 1862, I held 7 years of Dubois' business dealings in perfect memory, thousands upon thousands of transactions, hundreds of thousands of individual numbers, a complete map of an illegal empire that existed nowhere except in my thoughts. The Civil War complicated everything. The Union blockade of southern ports should have destroyed Dubois' business, but instead he adapted with remarkable flexibility, using his knowledge of Caribbean shipping lanes and his network of corrupted officials to run the blockade regularly. He smuggled goods to and from the Confederacy, selling weapons to the south and cotton to the north, profiting from both sides of the conflict. The numbers were staggering. In 1861, before the war, Dubois' annual profit had been approximately $180,000, an enormous sum, but largely theoretical, since much of it was reinvested in new ventures. In 1862, his profit was over $400,000. In 1863, it exceeded $650,000. The war, with all its horror and death, had made Dubois spectacularly wealthy, and I tracked every penny of it, every smuggled rifle at $15 that should have cost $8, every bale of cotton purchased from desperate southern planters at $30 and sold in England for $85, every payment to corrupt officials, every bribe to Union naval officers who looked the other way, every kickback to Confederate quartermasters who diverted military supplies for private profit. I also began to understand my own leverage more clearly. In early 1864, Dubois fell seriously ill with pneumonia, and for 2 terrifying weeks it seemed like he might die. His lawyers came to the mansion preparing his will, and there was frantic discussion about what would happen to his business empire if he passed. That's when it became clear, without me the business would collapse immediately. There were no records, no documentation, no way for anyone, not his family, not his partners, not his lawyers, to reconstruct what existed where, who owed what to whom, which officials were being bribed, which smuggling routes were safe. Everything was in my head. Dubois survived the illness, but the incident changed our relationship. He'd always treated me well out of recognition that I was valuable. Now he treated me well because he understood that I held his entire fortune hostage in my memory. "If something happens to me," he said, when he'd recovered enough to speak clearly, "you could destroy my family, could refuse to share what you know, or sell information to my competitors, or go to the authorities with evidence that would send my associates to prison." "Yes, sir," I agreed calmly. "I could do all those things." "Why don't you?" "Because I'm not free yet, sir, because I'm well treated here, but still property, because I'm building my own fortune, slowly using the wages you pay me, but I don't have enough yet to live independently, and because—" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Because I find the work intellectually satisfying. The numbers are beautiful to me. The patterns are elegant. This is the first time in my life that my difference has been an advantage rather than a curse. I don't want to destroy it. I want to continue it, under terms that benefit both of us." Dubois studied me for a long moment. Then he reached into his desk and pulled out a legal document. "These are manumission papers. They declare you free as of today. I'm also offering you a contract, employment as my financial comptroller, at a salary of $500 per month, with bonuses based on the profitability of the ventures you advise on. You'll live in this house as my employee, rather than my property. You'll continue the work you've been doing, but as a free woman receiving fair compensation, $500 per month, $6,000 per year. It was more money than most free people earned, white or black. It was a fortune." "And when you die?" I asked. "What happens then?" "These terms continue with my son, who will inherit the business. He'll be trained to work with you, to trust your calculations, to rely on your memory. You'll advise the family for as long as you choose to do so. And when you eventually decide to leave, we'll provide you with a settlement of $100,000, enough to live independently in comfort for the rest of your life. It was the deal of a lifetime. Freedom, wealth, security, and work that used my abilities rather than fighting against them. I accept, I said. So in 1864, 7 years after being sold as worthless, I became legally free. The papers were filed, the contracts were signed, and Ada the slave became Ada the employee, Ada the financial genius, Ada the woman whose mind held an empire. The war ended the following year. Slavery was abolished throughout the country, which meant my manumission papers became merely historical documents rather than special exceptions. But my position in Dubois' organization only grew stronger. With the war over, Dubois began transitioning his business from smuggling to more legitimate operations, shipping, trade, investment in railroads and banks. But the transition required all the detailed knowledge I held in my memory. Which debts were still owed from the war years? Which officials had been compromised and might be vulnerable to blackmail? Which competitors had weaknesses we could exploit? I guided the family through the transition, my calculations showing them which ventures would succeed and which would fail. Every prediction I made was based on patterns I could see in the numbers, trends that were invisible to anyone who didn't have access to complete information. And I began building my own wealth aggressively. The wages Dubois paid me were invested carefully in property and businesses, always through intermediaries, because a black woman, even a free one, would face enormous obstacles trying to conduct business openly in Reconstruction-era New Orleans. By 1870, I had accumulated personal wealth of over $50,000. By 1875, it exceeded $150,000. I owned properties throughout New Orleans, held shares in multiple businesses, had investments in banks and railroads, all through shell corporations and white business partners who fronted for me in exchange for percentages of the profits. Then, in the spring of 1874, something happened that brought my past crashing back into my present. Dubois received a letter from Mississippi. A plantation owner named Thompson, my former master, was requesting an urgent meeting. He was in dire financial straits and was seeking a substantial loan to save his failing plantation. When Dubois told me, I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Thompson, the man who'd called me useless, who'd sold me as barely worth rope, who'd been shocked when someone actually paid serious money for his worst investment. "Will you meet with him?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. Dubois looked at me with knowing eyes. "That depends. You've never told me much about your time on his plantation, Ada. Should I meet with him?" I could have said yes, let the business proceed on its own merits. Or I could have said no, refused the meeting, but that would have seemed petty and unprofessional. Instead, I made a different choice. "I think you should meet with him, sir, but I think I should be present at that meeting, as your comptroller and financial advisor, as the person who will evaluate whether he's a sound credit risk." Dubois smiled slowly, understanding immediately what I was suggesting. "That's remarkably bold of you, Ada. Thompson taught me many lessons during the 20 years he owned me," I said quietly. "He taught me that I was worthless, that I was broken, that I had no value. I think it's time I taught him a lesson in return. The lesson that his assumptions were wrong, that his evaluation was flawed, and that his worst investment turned out to be the most valuable thing he ever owned. And what will this lesson cost him?" "That depends on what your calculations show he deserves," I said, "but I suspect it will be expensive." The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Thompson arrived at the mansion on Esplanade Avenue at precisely 2 in the afternoon, punctual at least, dressed in a suit that had once been fine, but now showed signs of wear and age. The war had been hard on Mississippi planters, destroying their labor system and collapsing their land values. Thompson's situation was made worse by poor financial decisions, investments that had failed, land sales at bad times, attempts to compete with more efficient farming operations using free labor. I'd calculated his financial trajectory from general knowledge of Mississippi plantation economics and specific information I'd gleaned from business associates who'd dealt with him. He was probably 6 months from complete bankruptcy, maybe less. The loan he was seeking, I estimated $30,000, would buy him perhaps 2 years if he managed it perfectly, which his track record suggested he wouldn't. He was shown into Dubois' study at precisely 2:03 p.m., his footsteps uncertain on the marble floors, intimidated by the wealth displayed throughout the house. Dubois was seated behind his desk, exuding authority and prosperity. And I was there too, seated in a chair beside the desk, dressed in a fine gown of deep blue silk that had cost more than Thompson used to spend feeding his entire workforce for a month. Thompson entered, focused on Dubois, barely glancing at me. "Monsieur Dubois, thank you for agreeing to see me. I know you're a busy man and I appreciate your time. I've come to discuss a business loan that could be mutually beneficial. My plantation in Mississippi." He stopped mid-sentence, his words dying as his eyes finally registered who was sitting in the room. The color drained from his face like water from a broken barrel. "Ada," he said, his voice carrying pure disbelief. I inclined my head slightly, a gesture that was civil but not deferential. "Mr. Thompson, it's been some time." He looked from me to Dubois and back, confusion warring with shock. "I don't understand. What is how are you?" "My comptroller," Dubois said smoothly, his English carrying its characteristic French accent. "Ada manages all of my financial affairs. She has perfect recall of every transaction, every investment, every detail of my businesses. She's the most valuable asset my company possesses. Surely you recognize her, though. I purchased her from you 17 years ago, for $2,000 if my records are correct, or rather, if Ada's memory is correct, which is far more reliable than any written record." Thompson's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. He'd come here desperate, hoping to borrow money to save his failing plantation. Instead, he'd discovered that the slave he'd dismissed as worthless was now sitting in a position of obvious power and influence, dressed in expensive clothes, being described as invaluable by one of New Orleans' wealthiest businessmen. I had no idea she could," he stammered. "No," I said quietly, my voice calm but carrying an edge like a blade wrapped in silk. "You didn't. You never asked. You saw someone who couldn't pick cotton at the pace you demanded, and you assumed that meant I had no value whatsoever. You never once considered that my mind might be exceptional rather than deficient. You measured me only by the most obvious metrics, and found me wanting. It never occurred to you that I was seeing and calculating things you couldn't even imagine." Dubois gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Please, Mr. Thompson, sit. You came to discuss a loan, I believe. Ada, would you please provide Mr. Thompson with a comprehensive financial analysis?" This was it. The moment I'd been waiting for without quite knowing I was waiting for it. The chance to show Thompson exactly what he'd overlooked, exactly what he'd lost. I didn't need to consult any papers. The numbers were all there in my mind, not from Dubois' records, but from my own memory, from 20 years of living on Thompson's plantation, from watching and listening and calculating, even when everyone thought I was too slow to understand anything. The Thompson plantation, I began, my voice steady and professional, consisted of 800 acres, in 3 discontinuous parcels totaling precisely 847 acres, if you include the unusable swampland on the eastern border. Before the war, it was worked by approximately 123 enslaved people, fluctuating slightly based on births, deaths, and occasional sales. Annual cotton production averaged 217 bales over the 5 years preceding the war, sold at an average price of $42.70 per bale, producing gross revenues of approximately $9,273 per year. Thompson stared at me, shock evident on his face that I could recite these figures with such precision. I continued, warming to my subject, years of suppressed analysis finally finding voice. Operating expenses including overseer salaries at $600 annually for Carstairs, $200 for the assistant overseer, equipment depreciation and replacement averaging $1,100 per year, food costs for the enslaved workforce at approximately $11 per person per year, maintenance on buildings and infrastructure, supplies, medical costs when you bothered to provide them, all totaling approximately $5,400 annually. Net profit of roughly $3,873 per year. though you consistently reported lower profits for tax purposes. I calculate you underreported your income by an average of 22% annually. How could you possibly know? Thompson started. I was there, Mr. Thompson, for 20 years. Did you think I was blind as well as useless? I watched. I listened. I calculated. Every conversation you had with your overseers, every discussion about finances, every transaction. I absorbed it all, held it all, understood it all, even though you never imagined I was capable of understanding anything. I leaned forward slightly. But the numbers themselves aren't the real story. The real story is in the patterns of poor decision-making. In 1858, you invested $12,800 in a cotton gin cooperative that failed within 18 months, losing your entire investment. In 1859, you purchased 63 acres of what you were told was prime bottomland for $7,200. I could have told you just from looking at the survey maps that the land was in a floodplain and essentially worthless, but you didn't ask me because you thought I couldn't even understand what a map was. Thompson had gone pale. In 1860, you invested $8,000 in Mississippi Railroad bonds that became worthless when the war began. In 1861, you sold 30 of your prime-age enslaved workers for $16,000 to raise war investment capital, then invested that money in Confederate bonds that are now worth exactly nothing. The pattern is consistent over decades. Impulsive investments in ventures that sound profitable but lack proper analysis, combined with a pathological tendency to value immediate appearance over long-term sustainability and strategic planning. I sat back, my hands folded calmly in my lap. Including the decision to sell me because I appeared useless in the short term, without ever considering whether there might be other applications for my abilities. You received $2,000 for that sale, probably your best return on investment in your entire business career, and it was purely accidental. You literally didn't know what you were selling. The silence in the room was absolute. Every number I'd cited was accurate, pulled from years of observation and calculation. I'd watched Thompson's business from the inside, had seen every transaction, every decision, every consequence, and my mind had catalogued all of it perfectly. Dubois was watching with an expression of mixed admiration and surprise. I'd exceeded even his expectations. Thompson sat frozen, looking like he'd been struck. The full weight of the situation was finally hitting him. The slave he'd called useless, the property he'd been eager to discard, was now the person evaluating whether he deserved financial help, and that evaluation was devastating. So, Ada, Dubois said quietly, what is your professional assessment? Is Mr. Thompson a sound credit risk? I could have said yes and taken his money while watching him fail, could have said no and simply denied him, but neither of those options satisfied me. The revenge I wanted was more complex than simple denial. No, I said firmly. Mr. Thompson is not a sound credit risk. He has a documented history of poor judgment and impulsive decision-making spanning decades. He consistently overvalues short-term appearances and undervalues long-term strategic thinking. Any loan extended to him would have approximately an 87% probability of default within 3 years and a 96% probability of default within 5 years. From a purely business perspective, it would be an unsound investment. I paused, letting that sink in, then continued. However, I would recommend a different arrangement. Monsieur Dubois occasionally purchases distressed properties at fair market value, restructures them under competent management, and operates them profitably. I believe the Thompson plantation, properly managed, could be restored to moderate profitability, not spectacular but sustainable. I would recommend that Monsieur Dubois purchase the property outright rather than extending a loan. I calculate the fair market value, given current conditions, war damage, and regional economic factors, at approximately $18,000. That's significantly below its theoretical value, but appropriate given its current state and Mr. Thompson's management failures. Thompson's face had gone white. I was suggesting that Dubois buy his plantation, his family's land, for a fraction of what it had once been worth. It would leave Thompson with some money, but no land, no business, no legacy. That's "That's my family's land," Thompson said, his voice shaking. 3 generations of Thompsons. 3 generations of Thompson men who measured value only by immediate, obvious returns, I interrupted, my voice still calm but with steel underneath. Who couldn't see past their own assumptions long enough to recognize worth when it was right in front of them. Your grandfather bought my mother when she was 16 years old for $800. He worked her until her hands were twisted with arthritis by age 42. Your father continued that exploitation until she died at 53, decades younger than she should have been. You sold me for what you thought was barely more than scrap value, when I was actually the most valuable property you ever owned. I stood and walked to the window, looking out over Esplanade Avenue, my back to Thompson. My revenge isn't violence, Mr. Thompson. It's not poison or schemes or any dramatic vengeance. That's not who I am. My revenge is simply this. I want you to understand what you lost. I want you to spend the rest of your life knowing that the useless slave you sold for $2,000 is now worth more than your entire plantation. That the girl you dismissed as broken was actually extraordinary. That your worst investment turned into someone else's greatest asset. I turned back to face him. Monsieur Dubois will make you a fair offer for your land. Fair, based on objective market analysis, but not generous. You'll walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else, doing something else. But you'll never own a plantation again. You'll never have enslaved people again. Though of course they're all free now anyway, so that decision has been made for you. And maybe, just maybe, you'll learn to actually see the world around you, instead of just your narrow assumptions about it. Thompson sat there, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. His face was ashen, his hands trembling slightly. "I came here for a loan," he said quietly. "A business transaction. I didn't come here to be humiliated." "And I spent 20 years being humiliated on your plantation," I replied, my voice still measured and professional. "Every day being told I was worthless, being punished for failing at tasks my mind wasn't suited for, while no one ever noticed what my mind was actually doing. You humiliated me for 2 decades without even recognizing you were doing it, because you never saw me as human enough to have feelings that could be hurt. So forgive me if I don't have enormous sympathy for your discomfort during this 1 hour." Dubois spoke up, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Mr. Thompson, you have 2 options. Accept my offer to purchase your property at the price Ada has calculated, which I trust implicitly because her analyses are always correct. Or decline and attempt to find financing elsewhere, which I predict you won't be able to do given your financial history and the regional economic conditions. The choice is yours, but I'll need your answer within 3 days." Thompson stood slowly, unsteady on his feet. "I need to think about this." "Of course," Dubois said. "Take the time you need. When you're ready to discuss terms, contact my office." Thompson left without another word, his shoulders slumped, the weight of failure finally visible in every line of his body. The man who'd once had the power of life and death over me was now at my mercy, dependent on my calculations to determine his future. After the door closed behind him, Dubois looked at me with an expression of profound respect. "That was brilliantly done, Ada. Brutal but fair. You gave him options and dignity, even while making the cost of his past failures absolutely clear." "He called me useless," I said quietly, returning to my chair. "For 20 years, that was the fundamental message of my existence in his world. Useless, worthless, a drain on resources. But I was never useless. I was different. My mind works in ways that made me terrible at repetitive physical labor, but extraordinary at what I do now. And no one, not one single person, took the time to understand that until you did. And now you're the one with power over his fate," Dubois observed. "How does that feel?" I thought about it carefully, examining my own emotions with the same analytical clarity I brought to numbers. "It doesn't feel like triumph," I admitted. "It feels like validation, proof that I was never the problem. The system was the problem. The inability to see value that doesn't fit expected patterns was the problem. I'm not celebrating his failure. I'm just existing in a space where my actual worth is finally recognized." 3 days later, Thompson returned and accepted Dubois' offer. The plantation was purchased for $18,000. exactly the amount I'd calculated. Thompson took the money and relocated to a small farm in Tennessee, far from the plantation world that had defined 3 generations of his family. And I continued my work, the numbers flowing through my mind like a river that never stopped, the patterns becoming ever more complex and beautiful and interconnected. The years passed. The 1870s became the 1880s. The 1880s became the 1890s. I continued to invest my earnings carefully, building wealth that made me financially independent many times over. By 1885, my personal fortune exceeded $300,000. By 1895, it was over $2 million. I was one of the wealthiest black women in America, though few people knew it because I conducted most of my business through intermediaries and shell corporations. I used that wealth to establish schools for black children throughout Louisiana and Mississippi, institutions that provided the education that had been denied for generations. I funded literacy programs, supported black-owned businesses, provided loans to freed people trying to build independent lives. The money Thompson had once claimed I wasn't worth became the foundation for educational opportunities for thousands of people who'd been enslaved. Armand Dubois died in 1891 at the age of 74, and his son Charles took over the business. True to his father's word, Charles honored my contract and continued to rely on my calculations. We worked together until 1898, when the business was finally sold to a larger shipping conglomerate for an enormous sum. My settlement was $100,000, exactly as the original contract had specified. Added to my existing wealth, it made me one of the richest individuals in New Orleans, regardless of race or gender. I could have retired then, lived in comfort for the rest of my days, but the numbers never left me. My mind still calculated constantly, still saw patterns, still found beauty in mathematical relationships. So I continued to work as a private financial consultant, advising wealthy families on investments, calculating risks, predicting market trends. I became something of a legend in certain circles, though my true abilities were always obscured. People knew that I had an extraordinary memory and analytical mind, but few understood the full scope of what I could do. I was careful never to demonstrate abilities that would make me seem supernatural rather than simply gifted. In 1903, I received word that Thompson had died in Tennessee at the age of 78. He'd spent his last years as a small farmer, never recovering his former prosperity. I felt nothing when I heard the news. No satisfaction, no grief, no sense of closure. He'd simply become irrelevant to my life, a footnote in a story that had grown far beyond him. The numbers from his plantation, though, remained in my mind with perfect clarity. Every transaction, every calculation, every detail from 20 years of observation. They were part of me now, integrated into the vast mathematical architecture of my memory. I couldn't forget them any more than I could forget my own name. I lived to see the new century dawn, lived to witness automobiles and airplanes and electric lights transforming the world. I watched New Orleans change, watched the optimism of Reconstruction give way to the oppression of Jim Crow, watched the progress and setbacks of African-American life in the South. And through it all I taught. I established the Ada Computational Institute in 1910, dedicated to mathematics education for underprivileged children of all races. I funded scholarships, built schools, hired teachers. The girl who'd been called stupid, broken, useless became a patron of education, someone who understood that minds work in different ways, and that difference is valuable, not defective. In my later years, I would sometimes receive visitors, younger women often, who'd heard stories about me and wanted to know how I'd succeeded in a world designed to keep people like us down. I would tell them the truth, simplified and edited for their understanding. They thought I was broken because I didn't fit their definition of useful, I would say. But I wasn't broken. I was different. And difference, properly understood and properly applied, can become power. The key is finding the place where what makes you different becomes what makes you valuable. And then never letting anyone convince you that their inability to see your worth is proof that it doesn't exist. I died on a Tuesday morning in March of 1930, 93 years old, in my home in the Garden District of New Orleans. The house was filled with mathematical papers, investment records, correspondence with scholars and business leaders. My mind, sharp until the very end, held within it the complete financial history of over 70 years of business dealings, hundreds of thousands of transactions, millions of individual numbers. When I closed my eyes for the last time, all of that information died with me. The perfect memory that had been my curse and my salvation simply ceased to exist. Decades of Dubois family business history, transaction details that could never be reconstructed, patterns and insights that had guided millions of dollars in successful investments, all of it vanished as my consciousness faded. But the legacy remained. The schools I'd built continued teaching. The businesses I'd funded continued operating. The families I'd helped continued prospering. The girl who'd been sold as useless had built something that would outlast her by generations. They'd called me broken. They'd called me worthless. They'd called me the worst investment Thompson had ever made. And every single word of it had been wrong. Ada lived until 1930, dying at age 93 in her home in New Orleans' Garden District. She never married, dedicating her life to managing financial operations and her own extensive investments. At her death, she was worth an estimated $2 million, a staggering fortune for anyone in that era, particularly extraordinary for a woman who'd been sold as property 73 years earlier. Her will established the Ada Computational Institute, which funded mathematics and science education for underprivileged children, until its endowment was exhausted in 1957, having educated over 2,000 students. Armand Dubois died in 1891, having successfully transitioned his smuggling empire into legitimate shipping and trade businesses with Ada's crucial guidance. His family continued to acknowledge her role in their fortune through 3 generations, with family papers describing her as the woman who built our success. Mestre Thompson died in 1889 in rural Tennessee at age 78, operating a small subsistence farm. His plantation was purchased by Dubois, restructured under competent management, and eventually sold in 1878 at significant profit. The Thompson family name disappeared from Mississippi prominence, their 3-generation plantation legacy ending with the sale. The auction house where Ada was sold closed in 1897, and the building was demolished in 1923 during downtown modernization. No official records of her specific sale survived, except in Dubois family papers, which described the transaction as the single most profitable purchase in the family's business history, $2,000 for an asset that generated millions. Ada's mathematical abilities, never fully understood or documented by contemporary medical science, would today likely be classified as a combination of savant syndrome and hyperthymesia, with extraordinary calculation abilities similar to those later identified in famous calculating prodigies. The mind they called broken held an empire no one could see. The woman they sold as worthless built a legacy that transformed thousands of lives. Ada's story isn't just historical curiosity, it's a powerful reminder that the system's inability to recognize worth never diminishes that worth. It only reveals the system's blindness. If this tale of intellectual resistance, strategic patience, and the quiet vengeance of proving every assumption catastrophically wrong has moved you, then join our growing community dedicated to uncovering forgotten narratives of enslaved people who survived through gifts the oppressors couldn't comprehend. Subscribe now to discover more stories of minds too complex for simple categories, of resistance that looked like compliance until the moment of reckoning, of power built in silence and revealed in mathematics. These voices deserve more than whispers in history books. They deserve to be heard, studied, and celebrated. What hidden abilities in your own life have been dismissed by people who couldn't understand them? What gifts have you been told don't matter because they don't fit conventional definitions of value? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's build a community that sees brilliance where others see only difference.